Democracy or monarchy? Which one is better?
Aristotle pointed out that all systems, no matter monarchy or democracy or autocracy, all systems are susceptible to corruption.
What is the benefit of having a new leader and electing a new leader each time if in reality the system that you're getting and the people that really rule the country, the deep state, if you will, are the same?
So I don't think the people in charge want their public to be more informed. But even if they did want it to be more informed, I mean, how would you even do this? You would have to educate them again through the system.
People feel like they're disillusioned because the means through which they are told to affect change are not actually the means to changing the structure.
The most important thing to get out of this is the same thing we started with, that it's very important to challenge our own assumptions and look at why we're assuming these things, how we got to this point, and whether we're correct on them to begin with.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Icarus Inspired Podcast. I am joined here by Filip good friend and frequent guest on the podcast. We're going to be discussing a topic that may seem a little strange, particularly if you're in the West. Topic of discussion is democracy or monarchy. Which one is better? And in the West, we tend to assume that democracy is the best form of governance, that it's kind of the telos, if you will, of our political choices. And of course, if that is true, then why would we be having this discussion? Why would we even question that? Um, I can think of two reasons right off the bat. One is even if the best form of governance we have now is democracy, does this mean that we shouldn't continue to revisit the question to make sure that our conclusion or our assumptions are right? Probably not. There's a whole host of issues such as abortion, the death penalty, economic theory, immigration, gender, etc., that we continue to debate and hear arguments about. In fact, one could argue it's quote unquote undemocratic not to allow for such a debate, to demand that one perspective be unquestioned or uncriticized. Um, well, how one chooses to set up their system of governance on which they are ruled seems like a pretty important question to not get that same treatment. And then the second is even if it is true that democracy is the final and definite quote unquote telos when it comes to governance, does that mean it is without flaws? Again, I'd say no. So perhaps by engaging in this debate and pointing out the flaws in our current understanding of democracy, we can refine and adapt our understanding of democracy to one that is better or improved. After all, that is how we make improvements to things, by pointing out rooms for improvement. So better trains are made by pointing out room for improvements in an existing one, and likewise with recipes, cars, paintings, and even computer software updates, as well as many other things. Um, and so, with that, I say let's begin our discussion, Philip.
Okay, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for having me back on the podcast. It's always very nice to chat with you about different topics. I liked our last one. If you guys haven't seen it, on the Bulgarian election, that was a nice one to go on and talk about my own country's politics. But yeah, today we're talking obviously about something much more widespread, and that is democracy. And we'll also talk about monarchy, which is kind of its antagonistic rival or something like that in the way it's been positioned nowadays in the modern landscape. I think the first thing I would like to mention is obviously what you started off with. It's, we have these caveats about why we're even having the discussion to begin with. To me, it's interesting because it has been something which seems to have been presented as obvious and self-evident, that democracy is kind of used in politics as a synonym for moral or good, right? Whilst monarchy, well, I would say not really monarchy itself, maybe dictatorship or something like that is used as the bad version, the alternative version. Monarchy seems even more outdated. Normally when it's brought up, it's more as an outdated system of governance. which of course, in a sense, is historically accurate. I mean, obviously, it's we don't have as many monarchies as we used to, especially in the West. Um, so yeah, I'll mention those things immediately right off the bat, which are interesting because, like you said, in order for society to progress, I mean, we obviously need to have self-questioning in any society. However, this is always in a bit of a, I would say, a strife. There's always a conflict here because a society itself cannot really question its own fundamental assumptions in a direct way, because that would obviously be quite a bad system, right? I mean, that means it's a system that directly tries to undermine its own assumptions, its own, basic presuppositions. So it's very delicate here, where we have normally a class of intellectuals, for example, like even in monarchies, there are people who are criticizing. Well, first they were criticizing different monarchs, but then obviously there will be much widespread, philosophical criticism of the actual systems. I mean, after all, if there wasn't this criticism to begin with, then the monarchies wouldn't have fallen, right? So it's pretty obvious that these sorts of things exist in society, but I'm not sure how to structure it because it seems like they're kind of fundamentally different, right? Like, how could you put in a static structure the dynamic need for change, and as you mentioned, like upgrades and development and evolution. So I have other criticisms of democracy that we would I'd like to get to, which are more I would say like fundamental criticisms of democracy, which have lasted for a very long time because the system isn't really particularly new. So there's lots of philosophical criticisms that happen, but the first question I have for you is kind of how would you even bring this about in terms of, if you notice this conflict we have between the dynamic revolutionary ideas on the one hand, and then kind of the static need for any society to preserve itself, which is why people don't want to question the fundamental assumptions we have in society.
Okay. So I think we should uh, take a moment and define one of the most uh, argued definitions in history, which is the definition of democracy. Um, Freedom House, which is used by a lot of people in the West, says that democracy is free and fair elections and a commitment to peaceful transfers of power, upholds the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a due process, protections for all the separations of powers with checks and balances, a commitment to and protections for free and independent media, and the protection of fundamental human rights. Now, most fundamentally, democracy is um, rule by the people. Right? That's what the word literally means if we were to break it down. Um, but that is very unclear what exactly that it means and what that entails. Um, you know, for example, like could a monarchy or a dictatorship be a quote unquote people's rule? And what even is the people? The renowned political scientist Claude Lefort, influenced by Rousseau, coined the term paradox of the people, which essentially refers to the fact that in a democracy, the people have to decide who the people are, right? Are they citizens? And if so, who gets to be a citizen? Are they everyone with a residence permit? Or are they even in a narrower set of people to be just one race, one gender, one ethnicity, one group? Um, Makes it very difficult to actually understand what we're talking about when we say democracy. And often in the West, people think that democracy is, you know, a liberal democracy and has certain values. Uh, and if you don't have those values, then you're not a democracy, even if you elect people. Um, so, what I'd propose is that we give a very just broad definition, which is to say that democracy is a state where its citizens legitimately and fairly vote in elections to decide who represent them in power or government. So that would include countries like the US, Hungary, and Bulgaria, uh, but not Russia, China, or Belarus. I'll let you tell me if that definition is insufficient or if you think we should add anything.
Well, I mean, if we look at the historical record, the only maybe correction I would add to this is I'm not sure if they have to be legitimate. Right? So, and I'm not even sure what that means by legitimate. I mean, there's definitely a lot of cases of voter fraud and, all sorts of things that go on in democracies. Now you might say that that's not a democracy, right? I mean, maybe that's an answer that you can have, but then we get into this whole issue of the ideal system and what in what situation do we even have it, and you're going to start sounding like some other ideologies which have this problem of does this ideology even exist anywhere in the world, or is it just using the name of it? So that's my only little thing that I would add there. Generally, I'm actually, yeah, I think that most of the things you mentioned are correct. The values you mentioned in the beginning of your definition are definitely ones associated with, so-called liberal democracies. So I think you're correct to differentiate between democracy in and of itself as something which is mainly about rule by the people. It's mainly a systematic thing. It's not really a values-based thing, but then you add this element of liberalism into it, right? You insert this liberalism idea, which is the philosophical foundations of why we accepted it to begin with in the West, and then you get this sort of values injected into it, where it's no longer just a descriptive system of how things should operate in a country, but now it's how things operate in a country. Plus, this is the only way to get these values and virtues into the system, to make them part of society. So that's where maybe that gives us our explanation that I mentioned in the beginning of why the word is associated with kind of like a good thing, as inherently good rather than other systems. The other thing you mentioned, which was interesting, is about whether monarchies are by the people or other systems of a government. I think that's a very good point because I mean, as we will maybe talk about later with Thomas Hobbes, who obviously defended a system of monarchy and absolutism. What's interesting there is that he does it, very much from a secular perspective in terms of rationally arguing, in that spirit of the Renaissance, from a humanitarian perspective about, well, we're in a state of nature and so on. I'm going to get into that later, but I mean, his argument for why you should form the Leviathan, and why you should form the social contract. I mean, that basically is what you were saying a moment ago about, well, aren't monarchies in a sense also an agreement by the people? So I think that doesn't mean that monarchies are not are democracies, but it does show us that democracies are really very specific ways of doing things, right? It's a very particular just system of doing things.
So if I heard you right, we should strike the word legitimately, um, and just say democracy is a state where its citizens fairly vote in elections to decide who will represent them in power or government.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more leaning, inclined to go that way because look, we already established that. I mean, I'm kind of following your definition from the beginning because, like I said, you said, well, democracy is just the way things work, right? It's a system about how things should work. Um, and then you said those other things are kind of associated with liberal democracies, but they're not necessarily inherent to democracy itself, because even defining what a citizen is, as you know from the history of Greece with like the first democracies in Athens, I mean, even that was a different question about the citizenry was actually not everyone, right? As we would have it nowadays. And even nowadays, it's kind of again, there's questions about that. So I think that's why I'm following that definition of, okay, if we're removing the values and the morals inserted into the word and just trying to get to the actual system, the way it works, then yes, I mean, historically speaking, I mean, you mentioned a couple of countries there, America, Britain, Bulgaria. You're saying they're all democracies. I mean, yes, on paper they're all democracies, but then if we're kind of inserting these values of fair and legitimate voting, for example, I'm starting to question the definitions. And I mean, a more cynical person might even say maybe there aren't any democracies. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical of that one.
So okay, and you're right about the citizens who gets to decide and what's a citizen because as I mentioned, the paradox of the people, like it, it it's interesting because in a democracy, right, like as I said, the people are the ones deciding or In a true democracy, it would be the people who make the decision about who the people are. And of course, that's impossible, right? Because if you exclude a certain group from that, then, it's like, well, if you just exclude a certain group from the people that are deciding who gets to be the people, and then those people exclude that group from what constitutes the people, then is it the people who really decide? Or like, you could just run in circles about that. Because if you're saying that the people are who gets to decide who the people are, then you're using people in the first sense without to define who the people are without actually having defined who the people are. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario there because if we're taking it as the people define themselves, I mean, in the beginning, when you're forming the democracy, I mean, how are the people defining themselves? Because the question is, who's defining who? I mean, we haven't established who the people are to begin with, so how are they going to define themselves? Because if we have established them, then they don't have to define themselves, right? So that's the kind of the issue, and that's why you get this idea. Well, probably there's some group of people chosen to dictate who the people are to begin with, right? Which which then immediately puts the question of, is this even a correct definition of democracy to begin with?
Right, right. Okay, well, in any case, I think our revised definition that we're working with for now, which may not be may have flaws, like democracy has flaws, but may be sufficient for today. A democracy is a state where its citizens vote in elections to decide who will represent them in power or government.
Yeah, I think we can work with that. I mean, we don't need a perfect definition or to get tied up into some sort of linguistic games. I mean, everyone knows, generally speaking, what we're talking about, so I think we're fine to continue on with.
Okay. And really quickly, I just want to say that I don't plan to have this discussion revolve around empirical arguments um, for democracy versus monarchy, and there's two really that are posed primarily, and that's the democratic peace thesis, which is that democracies tend not to go to war with each other, um, and the argument that, well, if you look at on a whole democracies versus non-democracies, generally democracies tend to have a higher uh, per capita wealth, and its citizens, the welfare of its citizens, tend to be generally more better off than non-democracies. There's a number of points we could make to dissect those arguments and why they're ineffectual, which could be saved for another time. For me, just really quickly, I think that on the democratic peace thesis, one thing I'll point out is even if democracies have not gone to war with each other or have not gone to war with other democracies, um, they've still intervened and committed acts of foreign interference in democratic countries. So, for example, the US and the UK have intervened in Indonesia's democracy, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo's democracy, in Chile's democracy, in Brazil's democracy, and in some cases, done so to implement a more authoritarian, more undemocratic regime in the place for the democratically elected regime, which itself shows enormous hypocrisy because even quote unquote fully fledged democracies like the US, Great Britain, or France show that they do not trust or do not support uh, democracy or democratic regimes, and that they do not trust those quote unquote people to elect a government. Um, and then there's also the argument for just quickly, democracies are much better off per capita than non-democracies. I think it's important to look at why those countries are better off, and is it due to the fact that they're democratic, or is it due to other things that may be undemocratic, like slavery, colonialism, or even things that are not related to democracy, like geography or resources. Um, and I think if one reflects upon it, it's probably due to those latter factors and not to the fact that they're inherently democratic and the fact that they're democratic makes them wealthy. But I'll let you respond to either of those things if you'd like.
I mean, yeah, I would say that I basically am in agreement with your points on both of those things. I've heard both of them. On the democratic, peace thesis that they have, I would just like to say, I mean, kind of like what you were saying, it's pretty obvious this is a case of trying to get other democracies to be more like liberal democracies most of the time. And then by liberal democracies, what we mean is that they share the same values as Western democracies. And by sharing the same values, what we really mean is that they share the same interests and they look out for our interests. So they're kind of an extension of our own self-interest. Now, this is obviously a very realist take, and that's kind of the philosophy I subscribe to in international politics. So I'm not gonna, today we're not debating realism or anything like that, but I think that's pretty obvious if you just look at the way things are playing out, and it's becoming more and more obvious day by day. So I think more and more people find this quite, non-controversial to say anymore than it was before. And again, the similar thing with your point about the different wealth gaps that we have. I mean, there's plenty of historical reasons and circumstances which bring about wealth, so it's quite difficult to make an analysis of whether that is because of inherent value in democracy that transfers from moral value to economic value, although I'm not sure that's a case anyone will argue. So those are my responses to those two things. Now, do you want me to get into some of the more philosophical critiques of democracy?
I'd like that. I'd like to move towards that now.
Okay, because I have a couple that I've looked into. I mean, I was trying to get, obviously there's lots of defenses of democracy, there's lots of criticisms of it. From what I can tell, there's generally three that are pretty significant critiques of democracy, and they're significant for two reasons. One of them is that they're quite inherent in democracies. So I think that you will see these things are not something that democracies can just let go of. I think they actually sometimes view them as the strengths that they have over other systems. So they're quite inherent. They're not really something that you can just let go of in order to avoid a criticism. And the second thing is that they're becoming more and more demonstrable. So I think these criticisms are not something you can just brush off as idealistic or just sort of random abstract criticisms. They actually do have empirical evidence and day-to-day evidence behind them. So those are two things I would say which make them quite significant criticisms that you should be aware of if you're supporting democratic systems. Now, the first thing is to do with the flexibility in the system. So one of the things that proponents of democracy say is that a benefit of democracy is the fact that the leadership is mutable, right? So leadership changes. Politicians come in and out, depending on how many years they're in. Like in America, 4 years, or sometimes it's six or whatever. But basically, there's this inherent flexibility in the system, which is supposed to be a strength for democracies. Now, the problem with this is, of course, that this has a lot of instability and disunity in the country. Now, instability because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, when you make trade agreements and other agreements with other countries, there's this instability. Now we're seeing it with America, for example, where, you don't know what you're going to get depending on the president who's in charge of America. So this is kind of an inherent instability that critics point out in democracies, and disunity because there's not really any figurehead who acts as a point of unity for the country. So there's actually a lot of divisions in democracies because you want, one figurehead to lead a specific movement, but obviously this figurehead is going to be changing every couple of years. So there's a lot of conflict there going on. Now, both of these things I don't think are controversial. I think both of these things are things which democratic proponents would admit occur. They would just, try to argue that they're beneficial. They would try to argue that this is actually what gets you progress. This is what gets the system going. This is why it's better. However, I mean, critics, are I think quite right to point out that the problem is these politicians don't have any sort of inherent loyalty to the so-called people that are electing them because they know they're going to be out of office anyway. Right? So in a couple of years, they're going to be out of office. I mean, their interest is nowhere near similar to a monarch, for example, who is there for a lifetime and whose family is going to be continuing to rule the country, right? So there's kind of an inherent longevity and long-term interest. There's a continuity built into that system, which is not present in democracies. Instead, you have people being, well, the politicians are loyal both to their base and also to their benefactors, if you will, right? I mean, obviously, there's people who support them with wealth and donations and all sorts of things. So I think that's my first problem with democracy. And I would say this is, again, this flexibility is built into the system. It's part of the system. It's not something that you can just let go of. It's not like you can say, well, okay, my democracy is not going to have this, because obviously then it's not a democracy, right? It's going to have this. But these issues I brought up, I think, are pretty demonstrable. Now, I want to tag on my second criticism together with this because they kind of go together, and that is that a lot of democracies, critics point out, actually just go into oligarchies, right? They actually collapse into this system where the people behind the scenes, right, the background actors, the elite, if you will, the benefactors who are behind the politicians, right, they become more significant than the politicians because they're not a mutable force, right? They're actually a more stable force. Now, this is something interesting because a lot of proponents of democracies might even say this is a negative, right? They would say this is not how a democracy should run. You shouldn't have these people be the real power, behind the democracy. That's why it's no longer a democracy. They might even call it an oligarchy, like I said. But I mean, Aristotle pointed out that all systems, no matter monarchy or democracy or autocracy, all systems are susceptible to corruption. So the point here is that democracy is susceptible to this corruption precisely because of the inbuilt flexibility. So actually, these two critiques are interesting because you have the inbuilt flexibility causes the disunity and instability in the country. And then if you want the flexibility to go away, right? If you want the stability to be based on something, then it starts to go into this corrupt form that we're talking about because now it's no longer the politicians who are the representatives who are actually making the significant decisions. And obviously, this is kind of a, now I've described the spectrum, right? So because it's a spectrum, it's very controversial and debatable to what extent you lean into one area or the other in different countries. But I mean, this oscillation between these two kind of points of view is very paradoxical, and I think these two criticisms can be lumped into one actually, as a very fundamental criticism. So I'm curious to see what you think about this.
Yeah, I really like both of these arguments, and it's interesting because your first one about flexibility and how a monarchy, somebody who's going to be there for life, is more invested, um, yada yada yada. It's like the second objection, in a way, solves the first objection because you're saying, well, actually, democracies have an oligarchy that are there forever, and so the problem with democracies is they don't have that person that's there forever, but they do have this stabilized oligarchy form that is there forever. But then, in solving that first issue, you raise a new issue, which is, well, then what is the benefit of having a new leader and electing a new leader each time if in reality the system that you're getting and the people that really rule the country, the deep state, if you will, are the same. And so that's very interesting. I was reading The Prince a while back by Machiavelli, and of course, that's most widely known for is it better to be feared or is it better to be loved? And of course, he says both. Um, but he also says that he makes the argument that uh, people who come to power through hereditary rule, um, people who come to power through blood, uh, are more stable leaders in principalities because they already come with a sense of legitimacy and a sense in which the job that their predecessors have done are linked to them because they are um, their rule is inherited from blood. So they have less to do in order to prove to that principality's citizenry, um, because they already have that trust. Whereas if you're a new ruler, or if you're coming to power through um, elected means, you have to do more to show that 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 what you are doing is improving the people's lives because you are chosen by the people. You're coming in fresh. Whereas if you're coming into a hereditary world, all you have to do is not make people's lives significantly worse or not make people significantly more disappointed. And I think that's interesting when we think about like this argument of flexibility and you're talking about, well, somebody who's coming in for just 4 years or 8 years or whatever is not going to have that investment, long-term investment in the country that a monarch might have. Because I think the same thing can be true when you have countries and elected officials that are different um, in either appearance or race or some other quality that is different from the precedent, right? So in America, you may say that uh, if you're not a WASP, uh, white middle-aged man, then you have to do more to prove to the people that you are going to improve their lives in an election, right? Like if you're coming at it and your family has been in the country since before the American Revolution and you've been generations and generations and generations, generally I think that's seen as an advantage to people because you're seen as having um, a kind of perspective or a stake in a country. You're less likely to go elsewhere. You're less likely to have foreign interests. Whereas if you're like a first generation, let's say, from another country, and you're running for president, well, maybe there's more skepticism. Do you are you actually tied? Are all of your interests actually tied to making this country the best? Are you quote unquote America first? And so even within a democracy, you can see this criticism that you pointed out about monarchy versus democracy play out, right? Because um, even if it's not less, let's say, even if the time of rule is the same, the uh, stakes that you have in the country, or the time that you've spent in the country, or the time that your family has spent in the country, also matter to people. And so that's my thought when you had raised that argument. I do think if I was trying to think of a counter argument, um, you could maybe say that, well, because somebody only has a set number of time in a democracy, or a democratic president, let's say, has 4 or 8 years, um, they realize that they have to work harder in those 4 years or 8 years than somebody who is knows they're going to be in rule for forever, right? They know that their legitimacy is dependent on the people. They know that they only have 4 years, let's say, to improve things. So they're going to spend a ton of effort in those 4 years to try to make it better. Whereas in that same time span, a monarch might realize that he has his whole life ahead of him, and so he might be less efficient and less focused in improving the individual's lives in a set time frame than a democratically elected official who knows that's all the time they're going to have.
Okay, there's a lot of, to go through there. So first of all, I really liked your point about how these two critiques actually, when you look at it, empirically, they do play out in actual democracies as well. Very good points on the fact that, again, why do we value people who have a long vested interest in the country? Like in America, for example, they have dynasties as well. It's like, it's the Kennedys, or it's the Clintons. It's like, why do we value that? I thought it's a democracy. There's everyone's kind of out there. There's no structures, there's no power structures behind it. I mean, obviously, everyone knows there are. It was completely ridiculous to say that this is not the case. So, again, we still value this heritage idea. We still value this idea of continuity because continuity is existence, right? I mean, if you want your state to continue, to exist, then you want continuity in its leadership as well and in its ideas. And that's why I'm saying that you're kind of stuck between, a rock and a hard place here as a proponent of democracy in terms of this situation, because you're either going to have to say, well, no, it's all about changes. And this is, to your point, you said, well, these people make changes, they're kind of invested in making significant changes. I mean, that's really only true until they get elected. So really, they're actually only invested in making promises about making changes. And the more outlandish the promises are, the better your chances of standing out and not looking like a carbon copy in the election, which is true. I mean, I agree with that point. But then once you're elected, and reality kind of sets in, and these power structures which exist set in. Um, I mean, I think that's what we're finding out are these promises don't really come to fruition. So that's my answer to this idea that this inspires people to change things. I mean, again, my point is the system itself doesn't inspire you to do anything. You might do stuff. I mean, that depends on the person and the leadership capabilities, but the system itself does not give you any reason to do this. Whilst in a monarchy, again, you can argue the leadership might choose not to do anything, like you said. But I mean, I don't really see it as a vested. I mean, you have a vested interest in the country. It's basically your everything. I mean, it's your destiny, right? I mean, as soon as you're born, you're aware of this. Obviously, there's bad leaders who either do bad things in the country, or like you said, maybe they don't do anything because they know they're going to be there anyway. However, the repercussions if you're too terrible are pretty bad. I mean, you're gonna either you're gonna lose your head or your family's gonna lose their head. I mean, it's not like in monarchies you have the absolute rule. There's still the structures of power there which you need to appease in order to keep your position. There's plenty of monarchies in the medieval ages who collapsed and they were replaced by other monarchies. So just because we're saying it's a monarchy where there's stability, that doesn't mean in reality that it's always there. Obviously, real world politics still are something you have to consider, even though you're technically guaranteed to rule and your family is guaranteed to rule in the system. So I think those points are kind of mute. I mean, my point here is that at best you could argue that they're the same, but to argue that one is inherently better than the other, so far your arguments that you've presented, I'm not really seeing, or at least that one counter argument, when you're trying to play a bit of a devil's advocate, I'm not seeing that one as being very good in terms to say that democracy is inherently better as a system, because the problems still lie there, which I mentioned again, between this idea of change, or like you said, well, sorry, you said that they're inspired to change things radically. I mean, even that, if we agree with that, let's say it's just democracy, right? Let's say there's no background players, it's just you're really inspired, you have to commit to these things, you said you're going to do them, you got elected, now you have to make this radical change. I mean, that goes to the point about instability, right? This guy's going to make some radical changes, and then in 4 years when the other guy gets elected, he's said he's going to do the exact opposite radical changes, right? So that goes right into that point about instability. Now you're reinforcing that. And again, if you say, well, that's not how things work, actually there's long vested interest, the way we pick the people who are going to rule, you know because your representatives and the candidates for the elections are picked beforehand. Well, then you're going back into, oh, now there's this other branch of power which is not really by the people. So that's my point, that you really can't get out of this dilemma. You're kind of stuck in it. Either the politicians are mutable and they don't really have any long-term loyalty to the people, or they really want to create change because they're there for a short term. But then that's quite a risky, way of doing politics. Especially, I mean, 4 years is basically nothing in historical terms.
I mean, what I would say is, and this may be a somewhat controversial point for people that are proponents of democracy, but I think, or a particular type of democracy, but I actually think term limits are bad for democracies. Uh, the idea that, for example, in the US, you can only have a maximum of 8 years. Because one of the arguments, I think, for elections is that um, they're kind of like a checkpoint or an evaluation for how well a leader is doing. And knowing that those evaluations are coming forces him or her to, um, try to perform better. So, like, if you're in a school, for example, and studying, and there's no tests, and it's just all self study, well, yes, the people that are just naturally motivated to learn and get better, and think about things are going to improve as individuals. But for those who aren't internally motivated, they're not going to learn anything, and they're not going to get better without tests. And so tests are kind of a way to force people to learn the material and motive. It's a motivating factor, I would say. That's a large part of tests and an evaluation. Similarly with elections, right? It's essentially an evaluation. How good of a job are you doing? And if you're doing a poor job, you're probably going to lose the election. If you're doing a good job and people are happy, then they're probably going to elect you and choose you. But the problem with term limits is, for the U.S., for example, when let's say you get elected to that second term, then you have literally no motivation to take into account the people's interests in that second term, because no matter what happens, you're going to be done. Whereas if you abolish term limits, but say, you know, an election is going to happen every 6 years, because I would say you don't want to make it too short of a time, because then, like, not every change or every improvement is instant, and some of it takes time. And so sometimes you lay the groundwork for something, and you don't see those improvements immediately, but 6 years later you do. And that's one of the things I think that is often frustrating, and that flexibility that you were talking about. Well, you have one person, and maybe even they're like gung-ho about promises, and they're really active and motivated and get stuff done, but then 4 years later somebody else comes in, promises the exact opposite thing, and just reverses it, and it's very hard to get progress that way. So I would say abolish term limits, and longer rules allows for somewhat of a middle ground, um, where people are continually forced to pay attention to that, like, evaluation or test or checkpoint, um, and are motivated in that way, while at the same time allows for that ability to uh, not just implement short-term goals, but also long-term goals, right? I think if you're doing a good job ruling the country, and if people are happy, why would you force them to step down? I actually don't understand that. Like, to me, that's undemocratic. Term limits are somewhat undemocratic, actually, because if the people want a certain ruler, and the people want, you know, um, like what he's doing, why take it out of the people's hands? I don't understand that. And people are going to disagree with me, but that's my perspective, and so I'll let you respond to that. But I also, before that, I just want to say I actually think that the point you made about, well, a monarch still has to pay attention to stuff, because it's not like he's free from consequences. He could still get his head chopped off, or he could still whatever. There's plenty of examples. Some of that is a little bit, I would say, less. What's the word? L- Less true now, because we have these very advanced security states. So, like Russia, for example. Um, I don't actually know how many people support Putin in Russia. It's very hard to know. The elections say 99% each time. I doubt it's that, but I also don't think it's as low as people in the West think. That's not really the point. My point is that they have a very large security apparatus around it, and Putin's regime is structured around um, clientelism, um, and so it's not really the people that have the capacity to change the government, because they don't have enough power relative to the ruler. He has, the police. He has these wealthy individuals. He has a ton of power. It would really be, his inside people that would have to turn against him to overturn the state. And other countries too have have a monopoly on power and resources. Um, their Leviathan is greater than previous Leviathans in history, just because of technology and means of surveillance and means of control. But I take your point well, and I do think that one of the flaws of democracy is that it is harder to rebel because the sources of power and control, and this kind of gets to the oligarchy and the deep state, point, is harder to identify in a democracy than in a monarchy. So, um, if you're unhappy as a citizen in a monarchy, and if you're unhappy as a citizen, a group of citizens in a monarchy, well, you know who's responsible. It's that, king or the queen or whatever. And so you have a very direct aim towards disposing that rule, that system of governance. Um, you know, Even though you might incur a lot of death and it might be bloody and whatnot, you know very clearly how to rebel. Whereas in democracy, there's almost a problem of rebellion, right? Because you think it's the president oftentimes, you think it's the prime minister, the ruler, but oftentimes the power and the control is much more convoluted. And often in political theory, you talk about turning keys. And in monarchies or dictatorship, there's only really one key you need to turn to make decisions. And in democracy, there's multiple keys, and there's a lot of different check boxes, and often that makes progress and making things happen harder. But that's also one of the benefits because there's more checks and balances on power. People argue, uh, but I would say that from a citizen's perspective, because there's all those different keys in a democracy, it's much harder to know how to rebel. It's much harder to know to rebel, um, and it often feels, or people feel like they're disillusioned because the means through which they are told to affect change, i.e., elections, and changing that figurehead, that prime minister, that president, or their representatives, or whatever, are not actually the means to changing the structure or the systems of governance. And so they are left feeling much more disillusioned and much more like they are stuck in a Foucauldian panopticon than in a monarchy where at least they know who to blame, and at least they know how to affect and have system change that they want. Um, and so those are the two things that I'll say. And I know that was a lot, but I'll give you ample time to respond to both of those.
Okay, well, yeah, I'll respond to both of those, and maybe I'll also introduce at the end my third critique, which I think we can kind of put them all together. There's quite a lot to what you mentioned there. So let me start with, you were talking about term limits. I mean, I don't have a particular, position on term limits and how long they should be, or but one point is when you were mentioning that, you were saying, I don't understand why we should be against people who want to have a ruler who, is in charge for a longer period of time. I mean, I think even obviously you can change the terminology there, but even the fact that you said a ruler, I mean, that already for someone who is in support of democracies would, red signs, red alerts would flash in their mind. They'd be like, a ruler, that's not a thing. So I think maybe that's part of the problem, is that as soon as they hear, no term limit, some dude is going to be there for like, a long period of time, they might get quite angry at that. I mean, look at Hungary, for example. I mean, Orban was, in charge for 16 years, and they kept getting accused that he's not a democratically elected leader. Probably that long, period, stretch of leadership is one of the reasons why they said that. So again, I think it's part of this fact that it's not inherent in democracies that there should be term limits, but it seems like it's inherent in like this idea of liberal democracies that there shouldn't be any sort of ruled by someone, right? And if it's only for 4 years, you can't really say it's rulership or whatever. So maybe that's an answer to it, but I'm not sure. You're gonna have to ask, the proponents of democratic systems why they don't want to have longer term limits for people. Now, again, I mean, to go back to the point, I think for the listeners, you can either, to kind of take, I think from what I'm hearing out, and you're more on the side of everyone gets picked and we have people who are in charge and they try to make changes. So you're because I'm noticing you're addressing more that critique of instability and disunity. So I mean, yeah, again, people can believe if you think that way, then you would be more inclined to address that critique. But then again, if you think on the other way, where you're thinking there isn't really any change, there's lots of people who are cynical in democracies. They say things are just, it's smoke show. It's not really anything that actually happens. Because behind the scenes there's this oligarchical system. Um, if you believe that way, the things are ruled that way, then again you go into the other critique, which is could you even say that's a democracy or not? And if it's necessary for the survival of a state, which some people might argue, because again it provides that continuance which we need, then in that case, okay, maybe maybe democracy is not even viable. Maybe it's not really a system that you can have. So again, my point stands on both those things. Now you mentioned the monarchies. I said that monarchs can, get their heads cut off and stuff. Obviously, I'm saying this in extreme situations. I know that we might discuss revolutions at some point in the future, but obviously the French Revolution and things like that are pretty severe situations. But even before that, I'm just talking about monarchs being replaced with their relatives, their heirs, another dynasty. I mean, these sorts of things used to happen back in the day. And I agree it's not by the people, but I didn't, maybe I misspoke before, but I didn't mean that it's by the people. I didn't mean it's like some sort of democratic system where people had enough and then they removed the monarch. I mean, yes, I'm aware that they get removed by other centers of power, although I would say that there's not really only one key as far as I'm aware in democracies, or sorry, in monarchies, because again, you have this idea of you have the army, you have the nobility, right? You have feudal lords. I mean, there's still a structure of power. The idea is that inherently the monarch has, absolute rule, but obviously in practice, that is dependent on everything being stable and normal. If things start going bad for everyone, then the responsibility falls on his shoulders. I think it's an interesting symptom, however, that as monarchies started to lose support, eventually they started hiding behind this idea of symbolism, because before all responsibility fell on the monarch. And in a way, if there's a mistake being done, the monarch does take ownership of it, but at the same time, he can never really be seen as being wrong, right? So there's always kind of a shift of the blame. Someone has to take the fall. I mean, that was why they said that Nicholas II, right, that was wrong for him to take direct command of the Russian army during the First World War, because that put him directly responsible for all the failures that were happening on the battlefront. And obviously, the British monarchy and Elizabeth II had a similar idea of staying behind the scenes in terms of symbolism, so you kind of shift responsibility away. Although, in their case, things are becoming more and more different because it's no longer a shift; it's actually becoming reality. But you get what I mean. So there's a lot of nuances here in monarchies, and I don't want people to be thinking that they're very simplistic systems, because they're actually very complicated systems. And just because they were, dominant in the medieval ages and in the past, I mean, they were dominant even after the medieval ages. That's much longer lasting than democracy. So I think this is very important to note. Um, yeah, so I think those are the main points that I wanted to answer for what you were saying, because people can have different views on, like even between us, we can have different views on how democracies actually function in terms of are they mainly just background players, like you said, the deep state is that the main driver of them, or is there actual change and stuff? But I think the critique I laid out basically addresses both opinions. So, depends where you go with that. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, oh, sorry, go ahead.
My point about it being harder to rebel in democracies than monarchies was actually in support. Maybe that wasn't clear, but I was actually supporting your argument about the second critique of democracy, which is like that often it's ruled by oligarchy, and um, it's not the people that they think are getting elected. It's often like people behind the scenes in an oligarchy. So I was actually, in case it wasn't clear, I was actually trying to support you there.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I also remembered your idea there that you were talking about in terms of oligarchies, because yeah, that's another point to go with this. I mean, even if you in democracies, I mean, it's kind of the similar thing. You think you're replacing things, but I am generally more on the side of that there is this idea of continuance, which has to occur because there's background players involved. I think that's becoming more and more obvious as time goes on. I don't think people are, fooled enough to believe now that it's just purely chaotic, anarchical system where it's just random people jump out and they're like, I want to be a representative, and then they get. I mean, I don't think anyone thinks that's actually how things run, run because you can't have any stability anywhere if that's how things work. So yeah, that goes to your point that I'm not sure, you're saying monarchies cannot be replaced. I'm not even sure democracies can be replaced. I mean, I haven't seen any of them actually succeed in, replacing them. There's plenty of countries where I'm seeing people being disillusioned with the system precisely because they don't see any power that they supposedly have. And the only defense that I've heard is, well, it says on paper that they have it. I mean, that's that's basically what it comes down to if I have to reduce the argumentation there. Okay, now the other thing I wanted to bring up is, and here again, we have a dilemma because, okay, we're saying that on one side, the masses don't have control. That's one of the criticisms, Basically, democracies are hypocritical. They say that the masses have control, and then in reality, maybe they don't. But even if they do, then we go into that other famous criticism of them, right? This is kind of my third criticism, but again, these all intermingle, as you can see, which is that the masses are very politically uninformed. Right, and this is again bringing back to what I said. This is inherent in the system, and also it's demonstrable. Right, it's inherent that the masses should have influence in democracies. That's what democracies purport. That's their major virtue. Right, that they empower the individuals. So you cannot really remove this from democracies. But then at the same time, it's pretty demonstrable that people are uninformed about politics because politics are very complicated. And even if you try to follow through with things, again, they become very complicated. And even people who know things don't know as much. And they just realize that they're actually quite ignorant of it. Um, right, that paradox of the more you know, you don't know. So this is something that I think is pretty obvious. And again, I'm not seeing how we can, fix this because first of all, I don't think the people in charge want their public to be more informed. But even if they did want it to be more informed, I mean, how would you even do this? You would have to educate them again through the system. So the people in charge will have to educate people on how to vote. That's the only solution for the society to make them more informed, which again doesn't seem very democratic. So this is like I think another serious critique. And Plato even, he takes it further because he adds the moral element back in, and he says, okay, I mean, the problem is that you're going to have to, in order to get the most people to vote for you, you're going to have to, um, what's the word I'm looking for? You're going to have to favor the lowest common denominator, right? You're going to have to go into the basest desires that people have, things that unite them. And the problem is that means you're going to, debase the society. I mean, this is Plato's moral critique of democracy, that things are going to become worse because you're going to become more hedonistic, for example, because these are things which everyone values, right? These are things that most people would value. So you go for the lowest common denominator so you can get elected. You don't get many votes if you start talking about virtues or, philosophical topics like Plato's idea of the philosopher king.
I'm really glad you brought that up because um, I recently read a book by uh, Jason Brennan called Against Democracy. And in it, he, um, he argues that most people are, well, he argues that society is broken up into three groups. And most people are not political. He calls them hobbits. Uh, they want nothing to do with politics. They're not engaged. They're not informed because they don't want to be informed. They just want to, they want to be carpenters or they want to be craftsmen or they want to be scientists or whatever, and they don't really want to, be engaged in politics. And I think you see that a lot in society. Like somebody says, "No, I don't want to talk about politics. I'm not really political. I don't want to talk about politics." And then he says the rest of them are broken up into hooligans. The majority of hooligans, which he says are basically like people who are riled up by certain things without actually understanding those issues. So they get really riled up by things like gender or things like, like small issues that they, or they're like sycophants. They throw their um, support behind one particular person, and regardless of what that person does, they support them. um, but they're not actually engaged in the issues and understanding on a deeper level. And then he says that a very small part of society are people with real political knowledge. And from those three arguments or those three statements, he says that um, he lays out the argument for uh, why it should be the case that that small group of people with real political knowledge should govern over people with, over the rest of society. And so the three arguments, the three premises are um, it is true that there are political truths that are metaphysically out there about the way to govern. That's one of the premises. The second is that there are some people that know these truths, and that some have more knowledge of those truths than others. And the third premise is people with knowledge of those truths, or more reliable knowledge of these truths, should have the authorities of others. And he rejects the third premise because, just because, he gives the example, for example, just because I know that you should be eating broccoli and kale doesn't mean I have the authority to tell you to eat only broccoli and kale. Um, but he says that just because um, we shouldn't accept that, people with quote unquote more authority on the issues should require people with less authority to do certain things. Um, he thinks that it should be the case that people without knowledge of those truths should not have the authority over others or to dictate the decisions of others. So essentially, he uh, rejects the positive premise of authority, but um, says, we can reject the positive but accept the negative. Um, and I think that's interesting because it ties into the critique that you were saying about, most people don't have an understanding of the issues. So why should we entrust people who don't have an understanding of the issues and don't have an understanding about how to rule or how to make political decisions? Why should we in charge those people to decide on how on the laws that govern how we should live and how our state should be set up? In fact, his point is, I actually think they shouldn't have a right. People with less political knowledge shouldn't have a right um, to tell other people what should and shouldn't be okay. Um, and he's coming at it from a point of, you know, uh, epistocracy and advocating for epistocracy against democracy. But I think the same thing holds true with this critique of democracy. You don't even have to accept epistocracy to accept the critique. Um, and so it's interesting to uh, y- I don't think this problem is one that we can avoid um, in democracy. Like I don't so long as you open up the the ability to make decisions, and again, this is only on the premise that the people that you elect are the ones actually making the decisions, because if they're not, then we have a whole other problem that you articulated in your second criticism. But if we do set up a system where the people voting elect the person making real decisions, then we're kind of stuck with this problem of, well, are the people making those decisions really the best people to be doing so? Um, and again, the answer is probably no. I guess the problem then is, does monarchy put forward an alternative version of that that is a better solution, or one that people are more comfortable with? Does it lead to better outcomes, or does it lead to people with more political knowledge making decisions than democracy does.
Okay, well, again, there's quite a lot to go through. I will begin with the fact that this criticism that you just laid out, yeah, it matches the one that I laid out pretty well. Although this idea of epistocracy, as you called it, or as he writes it in the book, right, the idea that knowledge is kind of the aristocracy, I guess. Um, it's interesting because, again, if we compare it to Plato, and here I'm going to go into a bit of a metaphysical overview of monarchies and democracies. And, for our listeners, maybe they think that this is kind of wacky and a bit out there. But, if you bear with me, you see what I'm talking about. I mean, in metaphysics, there's this idea of the problem of universals, which obviously Plato was, the first one to really write about this idea. And the idea is that there's particular things, particular instances in the world, concrete things like different rocks, for example, or different people or different horses. And then there's this idea of them that we have, as Plato calls them, the ideas, the eidos, or the forms. And these are over and above the particulars. They're how we recognize the particulars to begin with. And we only know them through our rational reasoning. It's basically philosophical contemplation and inquiry, how you get to know them in a better way. So, for example, the form of man or the form of a horse. I mean, these things are kind of, you have to have a reason in order to identify them. And the reason you need philosophy is because philosophy is the only one that deals with more fundamental questions like the form of beauty, for example. You have different beautiful things, but then only philosophers really talk about like beauty over and above beautiful things. And the most fundamental part here is that we talk about concepts like justice and the good, which are also these forms which are higher up. So basically, Plato lays out this, uh, first of all, a metaphysic of reality, how reality works, right? You have the forms, the universals, and then the particulars are based on those universals. And then we have this epistemological point, which is basically that the only people who know about this, the only people who have knowledge of the highest forms, like good, justice, and beauty, are philosophers. And then we go into the political sphere and we see that those are exactly the concepts you need to be aware of. That's exactly what you need to know. That is what makes a wise ruler, right? You need to know what justice is, you need to know what the good is, you need to know what beauty is, and things like that. So this is his argument for why it is paramount that philosophers become kings, or as he says, or kings become philosophers. That's kind of the caveat he adds on, which is a more practical point about, obviously making philosophers kings might be a bit difficult, but maybe we can do it the other way around. Now, what's interesting here is you can see metaphysics plays a role not only in Plato's idea, but even in what we were just discussing. I mean, this idea is if we focus more on the particulars, then we focus more on the individuals. We focus on individual rights. We focus on, like you mentioned, what makes individuals comfortable, right? You're putting the individual's thoughts and opinions as, the most important thing in society, and that is a form of this idea of nominalism, which is, against Plato's idea. It's a form of going into the reality, into the lower strata, right, and saying that the universals are kind of not really that important. They don't really have real reality. They're not the realest things there are. Whilst if you're setting up more of a top-down approach, then you have the universals at the top, and then everything flows down from the top to the bottom. So that's why we have this differentiation, and you can see that in criticisms of Plato, right? So the most famous criticisms of Plato, as far as I'm aware, are Hannah Arendt's criticisms and Karl Popper, right? And they both famous philosophers. Hannah Arendt does exactly what you mentioned, Athan. I mean, she talks about this idea of plurality, this idea that all people are equal in society, but they're also unique. And she thinks that the only way we can actually express our own individuality and find out our own identity is through the political sphere, right? It's this idea of action, right? She says that action is the special metaphysical thing that happens where people participate in politics. And so for her, to deny them this right, to advocate it, to, allocate it, I mean, to some sort of an intellectual elite, you're actually denying the individuals a way of existence, which is their highest form of existence, which is through this political action. And then Popper does a sort of a similar idea. He says that this is, utopian social engineering. Basically, Plato's ideas. You're taking an ideal and then you're trying to force society and reality into that ideal. So this is actually this is why you wrong people. You take away their rights because people, back to Arendt's point, are a plurality. They're different. They're unique. So you're forcing them, to fit into a specific ideal that you have, and this is wrong. And again, the point is that you can see how the criticisms diverge, because Plato is saying the political system that I'm setting up is mirroring reality, right? That's the idea. Reality is structured with special knowledge of the universals and then the particulars. And if you want things to run according to the universals, you need people who know the universals. So I'm just mirroring the way reality is set up, top down approach. Then we have Arendt and Popper who are saying you're actually forcing an ideal into reality. So they're saying that doesn't mirror reality, because reality is actually plurality of individuals at the bottom, and then they get to politically be active and find themselves out in the system that you set up. So this is the completely contradictory systems that we have here, which you can say are, to oversimplify it, monarchy and democracy on both sides. And then you can say, okay, well, this is actually mirroring the problem of universals. This is basically the realism nominalism debate from the medieval ages. So this is why I'm saying that the metaphysic is actually important, because it basically directly relates to the criticisms of both systems. Now, I did want to, maybe we'll talk about this later. I am a little bit skeptical of this idea of Plato's, because I do think that Popper's criticism is not without merit. I think that forcing these ideals onto society is, well, it's what led to a lot of other systems which we would disagree with. For example, like the Soviet republics. I mean, they were basically based on this model of Plato's, which is that there's certain amount of people who have specialized privileged knowledge, and they're the ones who are going to set out the system for us. And this seems to be something inherent in any changes. I mean, even you mentioned Machiavelli in the discourses on Livy. Machiavelli also brings this up, because he talks about like republicanism is good, but he says, well, in order for that to happen, you need to have some sort of strong leadership to get us there. So again, it's this idea, you can't get out of it, that you have for the transition period, you always have to abdicate power to someone. And then the problem is obviously that's well, how is that not going to last? You abdicate the power to someone, are they just going to give it up so that they set up this ideal afterwards? So this is I think the more fundamental system that's happening behind this. Before I continue, I want to just get you to respond to this, because I personally find this very interesting, how the metaphysics relates directly to the political system.
I agree with you that I think Popper's response to Plato's argument um, is stronger. Um, I don't agree that I think what you said is, um, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the denying these individuals um, this choice is in some sense denying their sense of existence. Is that
Yeah, sorry. So, yeah, basically, Ren has this idea that there's three different things. There's labor, which is the actions we take in order to sustain our biological needs. Then there's work, which is when we fabricate something that will outlast us. Right? So that's when we make things. And then action is this political idea. And for her, in her metaphysic, that's like the highest level of something that you can do, because it's an activity where you show yourself, right, in the political sphere, which is not like a concrete thing. It's more like a metaphysical. It's kind of like Heidegger's idea about the openness of being. But okay, I'm not going to go into that because that might confuse people more. But yeah, it's this idea that you're going to show who you are by participating in community and in political activities.
great? Um, so in the same book that I was talking about, uh, y- which I found very compelling, Brennan kind of raises this question of like, well, does democracy empower the individual? Right? He kind of addresses Arendt's critique. Does it empower them? Um, and his argument is no. And the reason is he says that most of us know that a singular vote makes a tiny, tiny fraction of an impact on the laws and the rules that govern us. Um, and most of us vote in instances where the share of voters is too big for our vote to actually have real substantial consequences, even if we vote for non major candidates. And even if we do vote for the winning candidate, our vote helps them win. Um, our vote helps them win, but we did not cause them to win. He says that at best, when you vote in an election, you participate in an activity that caused the result, but you yourself did not cause a result. And what democracy does, he says, does not empower individuals, but it empowers groups. It allows one to participate and belong to a group that causes a result, but it does not give them power alone as an individual. Um, and so I would say that if you take that conclusion and you agree with it, I would say that my larger point is basically to say that I don't think it's so much of an issue that you're denying the individual, um, their right to their, quote unquote, their identity or their right to um, make choices, because um, so many times in society we set up institutions whereby individuals don't actually have much agency and don't have much power to affect things. They participate and join groups that have power, but they themselves do not actually have power. And it's by attaching to groups and to non-individual entities that they gain power. And so I would say that democracy too um, does not empower the individual; it empowers groups, and it in many ways forces the individual to join groups and to lose their sense of individuality to affect change. So that would be my response, and I know that was rather convoluted. Um,
No, I got what you were saying. I think this is something which kind of misses Arendt's point, and but then it actually still gives a good criticism of it somehow. So I'll try to explain what I mean, and then I'll tie that into my own thoughts on how I would what I would present, because I have an idea which is a little bit wacky. But okay, here's where we'll start. We'll start with the fact that I think it misses her point because Arendt, again, you have to understand the metaphysic here, which is in a sense quite radical. She is saying it's about the individual, right? So she's only looking at it from the perspective of how does this affect the individual. So when you're saying that this doesn't, you know, affect a greater movement, that the individual's vote doesn't really matter in the large scale of things. I mean, for her point, that's kind of irrelevant because she's saying it matters to the individual. It matters that they are deciding who to vote for. You get what I mean? So her point is more like it's irrelevant like what the actual vote does. What's important is that cognitively when you're choosing to vote, that's important for your individuality. That's important for who you are as a person because that's a place where you will act in a way that is purely out of your own identity. It's not about survival like labor. It's not about creating something for money like work, but it's political action, right? This is why it's important for her. Now, the point, however, that you brought up still, I think, rings true because the problem is that she is so focused on individuality. She's so focused on the particulars, right? The concrete, it's so atomistic, the system, that I mean, politically, we always talk about other things. We don't just talk about the atomism. We talk about, well, what about society? What about people? What about the nation, right? I mean, these are things which are relevant. And again, this is because metaphysically, we still think in this way, where we think that these things have real reality, right? They're actually real things. So when I say society, when I say the nation, right, these are real entities. They might not be physical entities. They might not be something I can touch, and feel, but they're actually real entities. Because if they're not real, how come we talk about them, right? What's the purpose of talking about, well, unreality, basically? I mean, they're basically, if they're fake things, why do we even talk about them? Now, of course, if you're a reductive materialist, who doesn't believe in these concepts and that they're real, you might say that we just talk about them in order to get votes. I mean, that's kind of the idea. But my point is that this is a metaphysical dispute, right? And if you believe that there's larger things like actual movements and causes and so on, then naturally you will say to Arendt, like you just did, who cares that the individual thinks that they're important when in reality, they're not actually contributing that much. So I think that's why you have this kind of talking past each other because of the actual metaphysics underlying this. Now, I actually think that whilst I agree with the criticism of Arendt and this particularism that she has, I'm not sure Plato is any better because, like I said, with Popper's critique, I think Plato makes this mistake of again trying to be idealistic in his own way. I mean, he literally talks about ideals. So they're both kind of systems which are idealistic because I mean, Arendt's system you can say is idealistic in the sense that it thinks individuals actually have autonomy and actually change things when in reality we see how things play out. And then, well, Plato is self-admittedly idealistic because that's the whole idea of having a ruling elite. But I'm not sure that's a better system because of this, trying to force reality to go back into the universal when reality is not itself universal. I mean, even Plato admits that reality is concrete particulars, it's not universals. So it seems to me we're stuck in this weird dilemma again between, universal, realism and then this nominalism of particularism. And I think monarchy is weird because monarchy seems to me to be a bit of a middle of the road system. Now you might say, well, wait a second, isn't monarchy the universalism idea? Right? Isn't monarchy basically Plato's idea? I mean, he literally talks about philosophical kings, but I think Plato's system is not really a true monarchy. I mean, if we look at his system, he's talking about communes and he's talking about setting up an elite ruling class who's then going to pick out the best ruler from a bunch of talented kids, and they're going to raise them in these communes so that they're loyal to the state. I mean, this is not really it's very close to a monarchy, but it's a bit strange because it doesn't have that weird element of monarchies, which is the unexpected element. Right now, monarchies. Yeah, did you want to cut in here?
No, finish your point, and then I'll say what I want to say.
Okay. Because I wanted to say that monarchies have this weird thing. I mean, most monarchies functioned on this idea of the divine right of kings, which nowadays we laugh at. But the idea was that there's this unexpected element, which is that the person who is the monarch, you don't get to choose that person. So whilst yes, you educate them, yes, they're reared for ruling the state from a young age. The major difference from Plato's system is that you don't get to choose who that person is. I mean, they can be, you don't get to choose that. I mean, the idea was that that was left to God, right? That was left to destiny to decide who that person is. And I think the reason the system is so strange is that it's completely contradictory. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's why I think Plato didn't even consider it because it doesn't make logical sense. It's not a rationalistic system to view things. However, I think the reason that it was used is because of this exact thing that it combines both this idea of the universal, of you're going to educate them in virtues, you're going to educate them in universal concepts, but also it has this idea of personal destiny, right? It's you don't get to choose the person who's going to get born into the monarchy. You don't get to choose who the next heir is going to be in a proper system. So you have a single person, a particular, who's going to be the monarch. He's going to hold all the authority and the responsibility that comes with that title, um, and he's supposed to reflect an ideal, but he himself is not an ideal, right? Do you see how this is a very weird middle of the road? I think it's a middle of the road. I actually don't think it's closer to the Plato. I don't think it's completely top down because you have a system where the structure is top down, but then the person who's going to be in charge is basically picked out of nowhere. I mean, it's basically equivalent to if you have the populace and then you just pick a random guy to be the next king, right? So you have this element of complete, universalism. You have this element of top-down idealized system, and then you have this weird kind of X factor in the system where it's radically democratic in a sense, if I want to be very, very provocative, because you're picking a random soul to occupy the next seat of power, right? The next monarch, the heir. Hopefully that made sense because it's quite difficult to express exactly what I'm trying to say here.
Just to be clear, you're talking about Plato's. It, when you were describing that, you're talking about what Plato's proposal is and how his system is in a way democratic because you're picking somebody out of nowhere. I just want to make sure I understood that.
Sorry, no, actually, I made the opposite point. I was making the point that Plato's system is more structuralized than monarchies because Plato's system is the idea that you have the intellectual elite who's going to pick the next ruler because based on how talented they are and how well educated they get, right? Whilst the monarchical system is completely it has this weird element in it where it basically says all of that. Yes, you're going to educate them. Yes, they're going to know from a young age they're going to rule, but you don't get to pick them. Right? It's basically equivalent to if they weren't being born, it would be equivalent to just saying the elite don't get to pick them. You can educate them, but I'm going to go into the populace and I'm just going to pick a random child out and I'm going to give you that child to raise. Obviously, that's not how it works. They're the firstborn, but that's equivalent. The idea is equivalent. So I was saying that if you want to be provocative, you can say that that's actually weirdly radically democratic because you're just picking a random person, right? You don't know who's going to get born. So there's no criteria. There's literally no criteria apart from they have to be born from the king. Well, okay, in paternal systems, it has to be a male, right? So maybe that's a criteria you can have there. But you get what I'm saying. There's this weird random element where everything is set up as a universal, and then but then there's this very particular element of you don't even get to choose the actual person. The particular person, that's something that gets left up to, well, they say up to God in the Christian monarchies.
I see. I see. So, in some ways, like a monarchy is a foil to Plato's rigid system, because with Plato's rigid system, it's like the elites, the educated elites are very rigidly choosing the type of person that gets to rule over people. Whereas in a monarchy, you're almost throwing it up to chance because you don't know who's going to be born. You don't know um, who you're going to get. Who comes out of the mother's womb. It could be somebody who has one set of ideals. It could be another person who has another set of ideals, and it's almost like a more democratic system because it's up to chance. Does that give me a thumbs up if I understood your point?
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, me calling it democratic is obviously just to be a bit provocative with it. I mean, obviously it's not democratic. The point is that they have absolute rule. But yeah, you got it exactly right. The idea is that, and this is something that frustrated the nobility back in the day because that's something they would criticize. They would say, "Come on, I wish it wasn't this kid, but this is the one we got stuck with." So yeah, I think this is a weird element of monarchies which often gets criticized, but actually in a way it counteracts the idea of Plato and the Popper criticism in a way. I'm not saying it fully does because obviously Popper was in favor of what he calls open society, so he would not be in favor of monarchies because of this. But it counteracts this idea that you're trying to completely fit reality into a particular ideal because you're taking into account something which is very real and very concrete, and that is the personality of the person who's going to get born. And you've no idea how talented they're going to be. You've no idea how receptive they're going to be to the ideas you've planned. So it kind of throws a wrench in the system, if you will.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about Arendt and give a response to something that I was just coming up on the spot, and it's kind of complex. So stay with me a little bit. But so if Arendt is saying that, well, the individual choice matters for the individual cognitively. It's not about how much they're impacting, or you know um, it's not about what the result is of their choices. It's just about the fact that making they are allowed to make decisions, that they are empowered to or not, maybe not empowered, but it's just that they can be a part of the process, that's really important to the individual. Got it. I think that actually favors monarchies, that the individual empowerment favors monarchies. Um, because in a democracy, you the way the democracies are set up is that it's like a very well-oiled machine, right? Down from the top to the bottom, where you have like village mayors or whatever. And you have all these branches, and you have all these checks, and everything works, all these gears and all these things that turn and make it work. And the way to affect change in a democracy is also, in a sense, predetermined. You want to change who the person governing is in your municipality, in your state, in your city, in your country, whatever, you vote. And if you don't like what the person is doing, well, you can lobby, you can protest, you can form civic action groups, right? But there's certain things you can't do in a democracy, like you can't riot and overthrow the person, but you can try to like lobby and organize and whatnot. And that gives the individual a lot of choices, or I wouldn't say a lot, but it gives the individual set choices that they can do if they want to participate in, you know, uh, enhance their existence, so to speak. Monarchies do not have that. There is no set way for the citizen to, or the individual to get involved and affect change. Monarchy, it says a lot about who gets to rule, and it says a lot about the state above, but it does not say a lot or set things for how the individual could affect change. And in that way, it is actually more flexible, I would say, for the individual, because all you do is you start with the state and the rule, but you leave this like blank canvas for the individual. So the individual has a ton of agency to decide and to think about how they're going to um, how to affect change in a monarchy, right? They're not given set options. They're not told, well, if you want to affect change, this is what you do. You just have the state and the monarchy and the person ruling the state, and then it's up to the individual to decide and to think about and to deliberate, well, I want my voice to be heard. I want my opinion to be considered. I want this outcome to happen. Well, how do I do that? I got to think about it myself. And then maybe I'm self organizing. Maybe I'm, uh, forming my own, mafia group that's like a sidebar to the state. Or maybe I'm, you know, going up with a knife and charging to the palace, and I'm gonna stab the king or whatever, whatever it is. Or maybe I'm going to launch a democratic movement, or maybe I'm going to launch a movement to install this other guy that I want and to start a new monarchy. But the possibilities are endless, and even if numerically they're not that much more than a democracy, the point is that there's no set um, number. There's no set possibility. It's up to the individual to decide how are they going to affect change. Whereas in a democracy, I know it's not institutionalized in such a or set out in such a strict way, but in reality, it really is, because the in practice, the individual really is only given certain avenues to affect change, and for the most part, they only abide by those things. And if they don't, and if they go outside of their realms and try to do something like a revolt or an overthrow of the government, or charging, they're told no, that you cannot do that. That's not okay. And if I had to guess, Arendt would probably be in that same camp of no, you can't do that. No, you can't charge the capital. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Um, no, no, you shouldn't. Um, uh, try to overthrow the government. No, you shouldn't try to, riot. No, you shouldn't try to do all these things. No, that's not democratic. We have set ways that you can do that stuff. Like you can vote, like you can form an action group, etc., etc. Um, and I don't know if that makes sense, but that is my critique of Arendt there, and I think it actually favors monarchy in a weird sense.
Okay, well, I'll try to break down. I'll try to steelman it, and I'll steelman everyone. I'll steelman you. I'll steelman Arendt. I'll try and figure out what's going on here, and you can tell me afterwards if I've done a good job of figuring it out. Because I was thinking about it as you were going along, and I think the main point. I mean, you were trying to say that you're not sure if individuals are actually empowered in a democracy, and you were making this point about monarchy, where kind of the political responsibility is not placed on the individuals because it's all placed on the monarch.
Well, so I'm not saying
If I
that
understood that
I'm
right.
not saying that democracies are not empowering the individual. I'm saying that monarchies empower the individual more than in democracies.
Yeah, so I mean, here's the way I would put it, and maybe you agree with this or maybe you wouldn't. I would be willing to argue, like I said in the beginning, my main point is not even that monarchies are better than democracies. My point is I don't really see why they're inherently considered worse. That was my point, and that's why I provided criticisms of democracies, which I think are inherent in democracies as problems in democracies. Now, we haven't gone through the criticisms of monarchies, but they're very similar. This idea that I just mentioned about the heir, for example, being random, basically, that's a criticism of monarchies that people have placed as inherent parts of monarchies. Other things like people not being able to affect change. I mean, these are things, or the fact that you cannot change the ruler. I mean, these are things which they say are inherently bad for monarchies. So, basically what we've done is we've basically said, okay, well, if we remove those things, and look at democracies, aren't they also having a similar problem? I mean, they're basically having the other side of the coin as the problem. Now, in terms of what you were saying, I mean, I think that I was agreeing with you about people being able to do other things in monarchies, which can free them, in a sense where they can do action, as Arendt said. I mean, I think her idea is a little bit strange because that means if we accepted that before democracies, basically nobody ever had the ability to do anything real. I mean, basically everyone was just in labor and work, and nobody was actually participating in action. Basically, nobody was participating in their identity, right? They weren't really developing as people. If we accept her idea that only in democracies does this metaphysical ideas start to happen, and I think this is very idealistic. I mean, that's what I said. It's idealistic in not in the Platonic sense. It's idealistic in the in the common parlance sense that it seems unreal. I mean, it's like, oh, democracy has the special ability to make you participate. Now, basically, the way we can level the playing field here between both systems is to say, first of all, just because it's not said it's political doesn't mean it's not political. So, like, I think this goes to your point. In monarchies, people can still do things which are not they're not labeled as political, but that doesn't mean they're not political, right? They still affect society, and if they affect society, then I think you can say they're political. So like if you're having a business, if you're doing some sort of thing that's actually affecting people, other people apart from you, which basically, if you live in society, you're going to do anyways. And I think people back then were very highly conscious of the fact that they're actually affecting other people. There were communities, they were very communal. So I think that, in a sense, you can argue in a monarchy is what is equivalent to politics in a democracy. Just because you're not like explicitly voting for someone doesn't mean that you're not participating in the organism that is society. And also, to go on the other side to completely balance the scales, in democracies, this again goes to your point, just because they say and they label things as being chosen doesn't mean that everything is completely free. And actually, if you place the weight of political life on individuals, there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of marketing, there's a lot of things that people do in order to influence you. So you seem more free because you go to the ballot box, but in reality, you're very much affected in order to choose things specifically, and because they know you're going to vote. So hopefully that made sense. But I was trying to steelman your position to say that you can actually level them out by saying in monarchies, it's not labeled as political, but there's plenty of actions you can take which are nevertheless political. And in democracies, whilst you can give the label of something being political, that doesn't necessarily mean you're as free as they tell you are. Because again, there's lots of parameters and restrictions. And I think in both systems, if you start advocating for a change of the system, that's not okay. I mean, I haven't seen any society or any government that allows you to advocate against it. Now, sometimes they allow. I mean, in democracies, they play a bit of a trick because they seem to allow it. But let's be real here. If these movements that are kind of like fringe movements, if they actually start gaining traction, like sometimes they did in the past, the government doesn't tolerate it. I mean, they put all their weight that they can behind the opposition, and they really try to stifle them and get rid of them, just like a monarchy would.
Well, and it's interesting because the criticism is, while there, as I kind of said about when I was talking about democratic peace thesis and U.S. intervening in democratic countries because they were undemocratic, or that they didn't like the outcome of the democracy. It's kind of like, well, often the criticism of these groups from the regime in a democracy is to label them undemocratic. Um, right? It's like, oh, your desire to have change and have a new vision and have that change be implemented through an election is well, don't do that. That's dangerous because that's undemocratic. Like the vision you're proposing is undemocratic, which is a little bit funny, I'll just say. Um, and that critique only works because we presuppose, and a lot of people I'm saying we, but most people in the West presuppose that a democracy is the kind of, they accept the premise that a democracy is kind of the telos or the most perfect form of governance, and um, any stray from that is wrong. And so you label somebody undemocratic, that's essentially paramount to saying they're bad, they're evil, their vision is, wrong. And so people accept that and buy into it. Um, you raised a point about, like media and propaganda and campaigns and whatnot. And I think it's interesting because we think about like people going to the ballot box and voting for somebody, and in elections, right? It's very clear that the groups, or the people that are running in the elections, or the people that are working for those people to help get those people elected, very clearly run targeted, um, what can probably be most accurately described as propaganda campaigns to influence individuals' decisions and to force them into a specific way of thinking, a specific choice, and often without giving that individual full liberty to make the decision themselves. Right? In fact, the reason for their campaigns is to prevent the individual from going down the path of making their own decision themselves. It's to make the decision, it's to make them think they're making the decision, but in actuality, making the decision for them. That is the point of these campaigns. And that happens a lot in elections and in a democracy because you're reliant on the people's vote. Um, I'd be curious to think about an analysis of how often that happens in a monarchy versus in a democracy. Um, Obviously, I know that in monarchies there's a level of propaganda and there's a level of like, um, you know, uh, well, we're trying to get you to be favorable to the regime and whatever. But I'd say that that only happens because the rulers know that the people don't accept the system of governance, or they don't accept that uh that their rule is truly for their life. Um and so they're trying to prevent a rebellion, or like people haven't bought into the contract of, hey, uh we have a king, that king is going to rule for life, and then when they die it goes to the next person. um Whereas I think in a system where that was truly accepted, I don't think there would be a need for as much uh influence and propaganda on people's perspectives. I could be wrong. I could be very off base here, and it could be that this propaganda and influence of people's perspectives happens way more in monarchies than in democracies. But I'll say it like this: in a democracy, it often benefits the ruler to have the people politically engaged. So even if people don't want to be politically engaged, they want to just be tending to their farms. They want to be just like, you know, um, doing whatever they want to do and not really care about politics. Oftentimes, those are the people that are targeted the most with these campaigns. Brexit is a great example, right? The reason a lot of people think Brexit happened is because the yes people to leaving the EU were were finding these people that were not active politically, didn't want to be involved, had never voted, and were like pushing, these propaganda and these lies to get them riled up and to make them political, even though they didn't want to be political. And so I think in politics often, in democracy, sorry, you get cases frequently where people are influenced in their decision making when they don't want to be, and are forced into decisions where they're not the ones actually making the decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with basically everything you were saying. Because I mean, look, if we're looking at, I like Arendt's idea. I think it's very nice. I just don't think it's a good way of. First of all, I think it's a bit idealized. I don't think everyone is finding their identity through political actions. I mean, if you just go outside and speak to some people about who they're voting for, you will see that I don't think people are finding anything that that interesting there. And the second thing is, even if that is the case, and it's still beneficial generally speaking, like we said, I just don't see how that is specifically in favor of democracies, like you were just mentioning. Now, I don't know. I mean, I definitely think you're right that propaganda is more prevalent where you don't have the people's support. So like oftentimes with usurpers, for example, if you take down a monarchy, you get in charge, you have to really push the propaganda because you're new, you're not the rightful heir, as they would say in a monarchy. So I think it was definitely more prevalent in those cases. But of course, any regime would have to have some sort of propaganda. So even if it's a perfectly stable monarchy, you still want to push the idea that the king is you want them to be well liked, and you want to push that idea that they're good, and if something bad happens, you want to try and get someone else to be responsible for it. But this is normal. I mean, again, these are things which are normal for societies to do. It's normal that you don't want your center of power to be blamed for things so that the government doesn't collapse. It's normal that if there's an infringement movement which is completely against your system, you'd want to crush it. I mean, that's what always happens. And I'm just confused by the pretense that in democracies this doesn't happen. Like I said, I think it's exactly the same system. If people actually started going against democracies, it doesn't matter. If it becomes popular, the excuse will be, well, they're misinformed. That's exactly what they would say. They would say they're misinformed and they don't know what they're doing. And all of a sudden, we bring back the elite idea because it's like it's not convenient for us. You're going to change our whole structure here. So no society wants. This goes back to my original point at the very beginning when we were talking about questioning, our assumptions. If that questioning starts turning into action, no society wants that, obviously, because that you're saying that the society would have to go through a permanent change, which means the government now would have to, disevolve. So that's not something you want unless you've got a guarantee you're going to be in the next one, right? So that's how it works in politics, and I think this is pretty obvious. Now, I did want to bring up something, if you unless you wanted to finish up on this point, because I wanted to go through a little bit of a history of uh, you know the defenses of monarchy, and just to outline what I think happened throughout the history, and how we came into this kind of idea that monarchy is inherently not very good. But just before I get onto that, I'd want to hear if you have a response to this, um, to my ideas here. Again, my idea, just to make it clear, is that I'm agreeing with you to the extent that I think it's quite difficult to argue that democracies are inherently better. So far, from the points we've gone through, I haven't seen it really play out. But you know, it would be good if we get someone here who's like in disagreement with this. I know one thing someone might say is, of course, well, propaganda and influence is not the same as structurally not being able to vote. I think that's a good point that someone can obviously raise. That okay, just because we're influencing people doesn't mean that that's equivalent to not being able to vote. You know, point taken. But again, I'm not sure in reality if things are exactly as they appear to be.
I'm not so certain that like elections, um, or like participating in elections is this like great empowering thing. Um, as Brennan argued, like you really at most all you're doing is participating in an act that causes change, but you're not affecting change yourself. And I think we need to get away from this idea that like somehow being able to vote in an election, oh, now we've given so much power to the individual. Like, no, we haven't. We really haven't. Um, I also think one of the things, and um, you've reiterated this point, but it comes back to kind of the central premise of this conversation, which is we don't have to say that um, democracies that monarchies are like so much better than democracies. That's not the point of this. The point is that we have trended in a direction, particularly in the West, where we view democracies as inherently and metaphysically better and um, unsusceptible to the problems, like that we've fixed the main core problems that we've had in other systems of governance. And all we need to do to make this conversation, I believe, compelling and interesting is to just show that no, democracy is not um, immune to those same problems and those same faults, or even additional faults, or that moving from a monarchy to a democracy doesn't induce additional faults and additional problems that may cause additional worries. And we can debate back and forth whether or not the problems that happen in a democracy are worse than the problems that happen in a monarchy. But I think that's a debate that we should be having, and we are having. And that's really the premise for this conversation is like, okay, um, just because even if democracy may be the best form of governance, that doesn't mean, or we've established that doesn't mean it doesn't have problems, and that we shouldn't continue to look and examine those problems and think about whether or not, well, are the goods of democracy, do they really outweigh the bad, more so than a monarchy does? And that's really all. I think if we've conveyed that, then I think this has been, we've accomplished a lot in this conversation. But I actually am very eager to hear what you were about to say about monarchy. So I'm going to shut up for now and let you talk.
Yeah, I mean, just to point out before that, yeah, I agree with exactly your point there at the end. It's the most important thing to get out of this is the same thing we started with, that it's very important to challenge our own assumptions and look at why we're assuming these things, how we got to this point, and whether we're correct on them to begin with. So yeah, I think that's a very good point there to end that whole discussions of the pros and cons, because I'm perfectly aware there's lots of people who, as I said before, there's lots of cons and pros for both systems. So I'm perfectly aware there's other things we could have mentioned. I wanted to go through certain thinkers in the history of political philosophy, and just to show you how this idea of monarchy kind of dissolved intellectually before it happened in reality. One of the things that happened, I mean, there's two questions, in my opinion, that are fundamental for politics. One is, what is the legitimacy of government? So, like, what gives justification for a certain type of system to rule over other people, right? So, that's your first question. And your second one is kind of, what's the value of government? What's the value of politics? And this is kind of like, what's the purpose of politics? So, you already saw these questions in our discussion. I mean, for example, Arendt seems to think that the value of politics is individual evolution and development, right? So that's something that's a metaphysical claim, that's a philosophical claim that undergirds her political system. So if we look at the way things used to be, I mean, one of the first defenses of monarchy, although as I said, it's a very particular type of monarchy, is obviously Plato. So Plato has this idea that the goal of life is eudaimonia, right? It's this idea of the good life, and he thinks that the state should be promoting this, right? So the purpose of the state for Plato is to promote the good life in its citizenry. Right. Notice that's quite an interesting idea, right? So he sets that up, and then obviously we go into the argument I mentioned before, which is that he thinks philosophers are best to do this because they have specific knowledge of the form of the good. Um, and that's why they must become kings. And then as we move into the medieval ages, I mean, we have people like Augustine, who talks about the civitas terrea and the civitas dei. So those are the city of man and the city of God, right? So he says that the city of man is the way we've established things as they are now. That's the city of sin in a sense. That's the particular city, right? And then the civitas dei, the city of God, that's your idealized version of government. And he's again echoing Plato. He says that this idealized version is basically the most essential thing. If government doesn't promote virtue in its citizenry, right? If it doesn't promote people living a good life, then in fact, this is a pretty bad system, right? Because what happens is then we're going back into the particulars, just ordinary humans living their own lives. And if we go back to that, then that's the civitas terrae, that's the city of sin, that you're disconnected from the form of the good in Plato's terminology. In Augustine, you would be disconnected from the virtue which is associated with God. So you can see Augustine in medieval ages, he's mimicking Plato's idea of that top-down approach that we discussed before. And the idea is that he even has this famous quote about saying that government is just a band of robbers if we don't have this idea of promoting virtue. Now, this radically shifts with the Renaissance, right? So once the Renaissance comes into play, God is kind of discarded, and so is morality in a sense, because the next defense of monarchy actually comes from Machiavelli. And obviously, Machiavelli focuses much more on human nature. He shifts the entire focus to humanity, as was the course of the Renaissance. And as he shifts into this, the value of society is no longer in promoting the goodness of the citizenry. It's no longer in promoting virtue. Now it's actually moving into just defending the security of the state. So he says human nature is actually bad, right? Human nature is about self preservation, credulity, fickleness, and these attributes of human nature. He says, and he argues, that a prudent leader in the Prince, right? He says that a prudent leader can use these attributes in order to defend the state. So you can see now that we're actually focusing on the what Augustine would say the sins of people in order to guarantee the safety of the state. Now, in the previous systems, this would not work because the goal was to make virtue priority. Now it's no longer that, it's just the defense of the state, right, and the security of the state. And as we move into someone like Jean Bodin, who also talked about monarchy, and he was defending monarchy during this time against other thinkers, like thinkers from the Salamanca school. Bodin also argues in this way, right? So he was during the French Wars of Religion, is when he lived, and he knew that these different structures, oppositional structures of the nobility, the church, and the monarch, when they conflict, in their interests and they have similar sources of power, they start to basically cause civil wars and anarchy, right? So that's why his solution to that was absolutism. It was this idea that you move everything to the authority of the monarch, right? So he has absolute perpetual authority. That was the idea. He's not limited in time or in his abilities. And again, this was all about stability. So now you see we're moving from promoting eudaimonia and the good life in the ancient and then the medieval periods with God and the theory of the forms. Now we're moving into Machiavelli saying it's about human nature, it's about the security of the state, and then it becomes about the stability of the state with Jean Bodin. And then with Hobbes, when he comes along, he basically, yes, he's defending monarchy again, but you see now he's defending it on those terms of a social contract, right? Now, even the legitimacy is no longer from the divine right of kings, that second question about legitimacy. Now that question becomes a question from, well, it's conditioned, right? It's conditioned on a social contract which we made. It's conditioned on reason, basically. So again, we're seeing this dissolvement of what was the defense of monarchy at the beginning, and then as it, we transition, the defense starts to change, the focus starts to change, the purpose of the monarchy starts to change. It goes from trying to promote a good life to just trying to hold on to the state as stability. And by the time we get to the modern period with someone like Karl Schmitt, who also defends this, I mean, he talks about the idea of the exception or the Ernstfall. It's this idea that there's political chaos, there's anarchy, there's moments like coup d'etats, revolutions, wars. In those moments, the leader should have absolute power, right? The leader should have absolute power in order to protect the state in those critical moments, in those moments of crisis. But again, you see, it's completely now it's devolved into just trying to defend the existence of the state, right? So the value of the monarchy has completely shifted. It's gone from trying to promote the good life to now just trying to hold on to any semblance of existence, because if we don't have it in those critical moments in this the Ernstfall, then the state is going to completely collapse. So you can see how the value actually starts to dissolve as time goes on, because monarchy starts to, basically the justification for monarchy starts to dissolve along with it. And that's why by the end, I mean, Schmitt is obviously very much criticized for supporting can I say the I don't know if I can say am I allowed to say the that questionable historical figure on.
The Nazis, Hitler.
Yeah, yeah, I'm allowed to say on your podcast. I don't know. Um, I mean, you said it, so I guess I can say it. Yeah, so I mean, Schmitt is obviously by the end of this, we're left with Schmitt defending, Hitler, but it's but it's because we're talking about this idea of the complete disillusionment of monarchy, where by the end of it we have the Wormsei Republic, and it's just completely, basically he's hanging on to like the last branch of any defensive monarchy. So that was what I wanted to show historically, how people might be wondering how did it transition from such strong support for monarchies to them being basically ousted as a viable system of governance. But you can see that even though we have defenders of monarchy throughout history, their defense for why it's legitimate to rule and also what the purpose of that rulership is completely changes as time goes on. Thank you for allowing me to get all that out.
Fascinating, fascinating. Um, no, I mean, that really was really interesting, and I honestly I don't have that much to add on that. I mean, I think I laid out my positions that I wanted to convey in this conversation, and I think we both discussed a lot of topics. Um, and we're approaching past the 2 hour mark, and so I just think we probably, for the sake of everybody else listening and for our own sake, we should probably end it here. And if there's more points we want to pick up in the future, we can do that in future conversations. Are you good with that?
Yeah, I think I've said most of the things I wanted to say. Thanks again for having me on. I think these sort of discussions, are very interesting and very nice to have, where we are taking a more nuanced position and trying to, kind of question, as we've been talking about, our underlying assumptions. So I'm very happy with doing this with you again. And yeah, it'll be nice speaking to everyone and being on the podcast.
And hopefully we get lots of comments, and it would be great if we get lots of comments. But no, yeah, I think the important thing to me in all of this is that we're having a discussion about it. That the topic is being discussed, we're thinking about it, and that it's out there. Because I have run into more instances than not where I feel like that assumption of democracy being just accepted as a universal good that has no flaws and is the best system of government, is just that's just accepted and not even questioned a little bit. And I think that does a disservice to people, but also democracy itself.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's spoken like a true supporter of democracy. That the most important thing is our right to speak on these issues. So yeah,
And being in the United States, that's what I want people to think. Um, okay. Well, anyway, Philip, I really enjoyed this, and I will talk to you soon, and along with everybody else listening.
Yep, it's been a pleasure.
Peace. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like.